The world may soon be teetering on the edge of a global recession, only 2 years after the last one. With higher than expected inflation, especially in the US and the largest European economies, global financial conditions are becoming tighter. In the US, reduced household purchasing power and tighter monetary policy will drive growth down to 2.3% this year and 1% next year, according to the outlook. China's slowdown has been worse than anticipated amid COVID-19 outbreaks and lockdowns, with negative effects from Russia's invasion of Ukraine continuing. Moreover, further lockdowns and a deepening real estate crisis there has pushed growth down to 3.3% this year, the slowest in more than 4 decades, excluding the pandemic. And in the Eurozone, growth has been revised down to 2.6% this year and 1.2% in 2023, reflecting spillovers from the Ukraine war and tighter monetary policy. As a result, global output contracted in the second quarter of this year. Welcome to Savvy Economists. Today in this video we are going to be discussing the global recession and how deeply rooted it is despite what the government is trying to make us believe. Before we get into the video, please make sure to subscribe to our channel. Also make sure to hit the like button and turn on notifications. Schiff believes that the data being shown to the world on the actual state of the economy is being manipulated, and the economy has been in a double-digit inflation for a while now.
I don't think we're approaching double-digit inflation. I think we're already there. I think that if the government was still reporting inflation the way they reported it in the 1970s, using the same methodology to calculate the CPI, the month-over-month number that we just got, which went from 9.1 to 8.5, I think it would be well north of 15%.
Wow,
so,
15. Wow.
Yeah, if we kept score. Remember, back in the 1970s, they didn't use owner's equivalent rent. They used home prices. They used actual rent. Well, year over year, those things are up 15 to 20%, whereas owner's equivalent rent is up like 5.5%. That's a third of the CPI right there. That is dramatically undercounting the cost of shelter. But we also have things like substitution that we didn't have back then. Back in the 70s, the basket never changed. Now, they just keep changing the basket. They take out stuff that went up and they put in stuff that didn't go up as much. So the whole thing is manipulated. So we have double-digit inflation. We're just not being honestly told that we have it. We got a $9 trillion Fed balance sheet. We got almost 31 trillion in national debt. We've flooded the economy with money, and we've really kicked it into a higher gear with COVID, when we had the worst combination of monetary and fiscal policy I've ever seen. And I called out the Fed and Congress in March of 2020 for the asinine policy response to COVID. They, on the one hand, they ordered businesses to shut down and workers to stay home. So they ordered a big reduction in supply. At the same time, they flooded the economy with cash to increase demand. In fact, they were dumb enough to send checks to people who were no longer working that were 2 or 3 times as large as the money they earned when they were working. So we had less supply, we had tremendous demand, and of course, prices went straight up, the opposite of what they should have done. The government should have cut spending during COVID. This Federal Reserve should have shrunk the money supply. If we were going to stop production, which was a mistake, I never believed we should have shut down the economy. I think it was an overreaction to the COVID. But if we were going to do that, if we really thought it was necessary to shut everything down and everybody stay home, then we also needed people to stop spending. We couldn't give people money to buy stuff when nobody was making stuff. We had to have a more serious recession than the one we had. But again, the politicians didn't want that. They wanted people to keep spending even though they weren't working. And, the consequences were obvious to me. It's just amazing that so many other people in government, couldn't see it.
Despite the global slowdown, inflation has been revised up, in part due to rising food and energy prices. This year it is anticipated to reach 6.6% in advanced economies and 9.5% in emerging market and developing economies, representing upward revisions of 0.9 and 0.8 percentage points respectively. And it is projected to remain elevated for longer. Broadened inflation in many economies reflects the impact of cost pressures from disrupted supply chains and historically tight labor markets. The economy report outlines some risks ahead, including that the war in Ukraine could end European gas supply from Russia altogether, rising prices could cause widespread food insecurity and social unrest, and geopolitical fragmentation may impede global trade and cooperation. Inflation could remain stubbornly high if labor markets remain overly tight or inflation expectations are too optimistic and prove more costly than expected. And renewed COVID-19 outbreaks and lockdowns threaten to further suppress China's growth. In a plausible alternative scenario where some of these risks materialize, inflation will rise and global growth decelerate further to about 2.6% this year and 2% next year, a pace that growth has fallen below just 5 times since 1970. Under this scenario, both the United States and the Euro area experience near zero growth next year, with negative knock-on effects for the rest of the world. Inflation at current levels represents a clear risk for current and future macroeconomic stability, and bringing it back to central bank targets should be the top priority for policymakers. In response to incoming data, central banks of major advanced economies are withdrawing monetary support faster than we expected in April, while many in emerging market and developing economies had already started raising interest rates last year. The resulting synchronized monetary tightening across countries is historically unprecedented, and its effects are expected to bite, with global growth slowing next year and inflation decelerating. Tighter monetary policy will inevitably have real economic costs, but delaying it will only exacerbate the hardship. Central banks that have started tightening should stay the course until inflation is tamed. Targeted fiscal support can help cushion the impact on the most vulnerable. But with government budgets stretched by the pandemic and the need for an overall disinflationary macroeconomic policy stance, offsetting targeted support with higher taxes or lower government spending will ensure that fiscal policy does not make the job of monetary policy even harder. As advanced economies raise interest rates to fight inflation, financial conditions are tightening, especially for their emerging market counterparts. Countries must appropriately use macroprudential tools to safeguard financial stability. Where flexible exchange rates are insufficient to absorb external shocks, policymakers will need to be ready to implement foreign exchange interventions or capital flow management measures in a crisis scenario. Such challenges come at a time when many countries lack fiscal space, with the share of low-income countries in or at high risk of debt distress at 60%, up from about 20% a decade ago. Higher borrowing costs, diminished credit flows, a stronger dollar, and weaker growth will push even more into distress. The simultaneous materialization of all scenarios presented above could reduce global growth to only 2.1% in 2022 and 1.5% in 2023, 0.8 and 1.5 percentage points slower than in the baseline forecast. This would correspond to a sharp global downturn and effectively push the global economy to the brink of recession. The prospects of a dire global economic outcome, so soon after the pandemic global recession, could have devastating consequences for the world's poor. Even if several downside risks materialize, policymakers may be able to fend off the worst economic outcomes. At a national level, a forceful policy response would require an urgent reprioritization of spending toward targeted relief for vulnerable households, steadfast commitment to credible monetary frameworks, and a general restraint in the use of distortionary policies such as export restrictions and price controls. Once the global economy has stabilized, reversing the damage inflicted by the dual shocks of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine will require an unwavering commitment to growth-enhancing policies, including large-scale investment in education and digital technologies, and the promotion of labor force participation, especially female participation, through active labor market policies. With the pandemic continuing to maintain its grip, the IMF believes the need for an effective global health strategy is more evident than ever. Worldwide access to vaccines, tests, and treatments is essential to reduce the risk of further variants. This requires increased production of supplies, better in-country delivery systems, and fairer international distribution. The fund believes monetary policy in many countries will need to continue tightening to curb inflation pressures, but fiscal policy will also need to prioritize health and social spending. In this context, IMF argues that international cooperation will be essential to preserve access to liquidity and boost orderly national debt restructuring where needed. There is also intense argument as to how transparent the government is to the rising economic issues, and as more concerns are drawn to the global recession, there is need for increased honesty by the government so as to ensure that adequate precautions are taken earlier by the masses to protect themselves from the collapse. We would like to know what you think about these rising concerns in the comment section below. Also, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications to ensure you don't miss any news. Thanks for watching.